Welcome back. Well, regardless of who the next president is, he or she will be left with the heavy burden of the Iraq war. In material terms, it is the most expensive war in the past 60 years, topping $1 trillion. That equates to some $2 billion a week. Again, the cost to Iraq has been catastrophic. The economy has been brought close to collapse, with unemployment spiraling to at least 50% and probably higher. Then there's the enormous death toll. The nearly 4,000 US soldiers killed in Iraq is dwarfed by the thousands of Iraqis who have died. In addition, more than 2 million Iraqis made refugees. Added to that, the destruction of Iraq's cultural heritage, including the famous Iraq Museum, are immeasurable. Joining us again are our guests in Washington, D.C., Rob Ritchie. He is the Executive Director of Fair Vote. In Cairo, Abdullah Shleifer. He is professor at the American University in Cairo, and in Doha, Edmond Gharib. He is a professor at Georgetown University. Mr. Rob Ritchie in Washington, D.C., there are two schools of thoughts with regard to the cost of war in Iraq. One which says this has nothing to do with the economic situation in the States, and another school says, well, the recession we are witnessing now, one of the main reasons of it are what happened in Iraq. Do you think that because of the economic situation, the Iraqi issue will become one of the top priorities for all the candidates?
I don't know if people will accept the direct linkage, but the Bush administration essentially will be on trial. And the fact that we've had the war in Iraq go the way it has, and now the economy slipping into what is likely to be a recession, certainly makes that trial a difficult one for the Republicans. So a lot of presidential elections at the end of the day are less about the personalities than about a judgment over the most previous administration. And I think that that's the challenge for Republicans, both on Iraq and on the economy, and whether they're connected, the voters may make that connection, they may not, but they're going to be concerned about both of them.
On the other hand, let me ask Mr. Shleifer in Cairo, you have estimates saying that the budget will definitely surpass $3 trillion US in the future, in the years to come, which means that there's an average a US citizen will pay more than $46,000 in taxes to finance war in Iraq. Is this something that will definitely have an impact on the voters' trends in the future, and mainly after the summer?
I think the impact is a long-term economic one. I don't think that's having an immediate impact on the voter. What's having immediate impact on the voter are the loss of jobs, downsizing. A lot of companies have been reducing their staff, massive firings, the fact that the whole consumer spending is declining, the sale and purchase of homes. These are immediate issues that are that people sort of confront. I don't think they're making that connection. In fact, I would say that the problem, the economy at home and the Iraqi war play against each other rather than sort of coincide, or one connects to the other.
Okay.
To the degree that the economy is in people's minds, that's what they're going to focus on politically. I don't think they're going to make that connection with Iraq.
While it's early now to set the results into perspective, because we don't know yet who is a front runner from both the Republicans and the Democrats, but let's just talk about the possible scenarios, Mr. Edmond Gharib. If it is an Obama against McCain, well, Americans would definitely say this is a man who is pro-change, while the other guy is pro-status quo. I'll definitely vote pro-change. Does it look that way?
To some people, it certainly will look that way. But before we go a little into that, I would like to emphasize, however, that if the economic situation continues to deteriorate in the United States, I think there are more and more American citizens who are going to raise questions about the cost of the war in Iraq that, as you mentioned earlier, Hashim, reaches $8 to $10 billion a month. So that's going to be a very important question. The second thing that I think is also very important is that the situation on the ground remains very fluid on Iraq. A great deal will depend on what happens on the ground in Iraq. If we see continued, for example, escalation as if there are more American deaths, that's going to be affecting the views of Americans at home. That's something that's very important. The violence in Iraq will be very important. The economic development, the ability of Iraqi troops and Iraqi security forces to bring about some kind of order, the ability of both the government and the U.S. to help restore the basic services are issues that our Americans are going to be watching. Nevertheless, I think the Republicans are going to be hitting, if Obama is the candidate, they will hit on the issue of his lack of experience and on their experience and the defense of vital American national interests. So these are issues that should be looked at.
Mr. Ritchie in Washington, D.C., if it is Hillary Clinton versus McCain, would the Republicans say by the end of the day she stood by our position, she voted for the invasion, we can't see any difference in principle, and therefore that could be to their advantage?
I think that it'll make the distinction a little less sharp. I think looking forward, they have some very big differences, and so that'll be a big focus of their discussion. I think that Senator McCain's a bit complicated as a status quo versus change definition. He was a big opponent of George Bush in 2000, almost defeated him in the primaries, and as a senator was a bit of a burr in his side, has been a reformer on campaign finance and so on, so that in some ways he will be more attractive to independents on other elements of how he presents himself than Hillary Clinton, and that's part of her challenge too. Can she reach beyond the Democratic base? So that I think that's what a lot of Democrats are struggling with right now, is who really is the stronger candidate for them this fall.
Throughout the last 8 years, we've seen top U.S. administration officials looking at the situation in Iraq to try to gauge a sense of the vote trends in their own country and try to fix the wrong situation, at least restore credibility. There's no doubt that the situation in Iraq is relatively calm right at this moment, but it evolves worse than that. Do you think that it will have a negative impact on the American elections? My question to Mr. Abdullah Shleifer in Cairo.
That depends on what happens on the ground in Iraq. If on one hand, the government in Baghdad, the Iraqi government, comes to terms with the idea of cooperating with the awakening groups. These are, the Iraqi Sunnis who have turned against al-Qaeda, have separated themselves from the insurgency, because many of them were insurgents just a year ago, fighting the Americans, fighting the central government in Baghdad, and now they're fighting al-Qaeda. Now, if that trend continues and the government in Baghdad is able to overcome its own sectarian tendencies, you're going to have a much more secure or stable situation on the ground there. And so Iraq will not figure as the issue. On the other hand, if the situation deteriorates, if the Awakening Council movement drifts away and some of these people go back to the insurgency, then it's going to be a hot issue, and the Democrats will press that point.
So is it, Mr. Edmond Gharib in Doha, is it an exaggeration to say that Iraq will have the same impact Vietnam had on the American elections in the 70s?
I think it's going to be different, but I don't know if it'll be exactly the same as Vietnam, but there is no doubt that Iraq will be an important issue in this election. But also, one of the other things that's important to remember is that I think not only the domestic situation in Iraq, what happens on the ground in Iraq, but also what happens in the region, what happens with Iran, what happens in Pakistan, what happens in Afghanistan. These are important issues that could emerge again and be affected by what's happening in this part of the world.
So, Mr. Ritchie, will we say that in the future the domestic agenda will top the foreign policy in November to determine who's going to be the next U.S. president?
Well, I think they are intertwined, and I think that as was just said, what happens on the ground or what could happen in other countries could make this front and center, just because there's such a stark difference on this issue and it has mattered so much to people. So it's a little too early to say.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. Rob Ritchie in Washington, D.C., Abdullah Shleifer in Cairo, and Edmond Gharib in Doha. Thank you very much indeed for your insights into Iraq and its impact on the political landscape in the United States of America on the eve of the primaries and the presidential elections. Thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.